That night, I watched my daughter-in-law raise a glass of champagne, laughing among her wealthy friends, while the screen in my hand screamed that my late son's inheritance account had just been drained. $5 million. Gone. She thinks I am just a grieving widow, too old to understand the law or complex fraud. But she forgot one thing. If a woman over 60 decides to take revenge, she does not just take the money back, she takes everything. My name is Margaret O'Connell, and for 64 years, I have lived a life defined by quiet resilience. I live alone now in a drafty colonial house in Riverton Heights, just outside the grey sprawl of Chicago. It has been exactly 8 months since I lowered my only son, Daniel, into the freezing Illinois ground. I thought that was the day my heart officially stopped beating. But I was wrong. My heart was still beating tonight, hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as the rain lashed against the kitchen window. A notification had pinged on my tablet. It was an automated security alert from Northlake Trust, the bank that held the entirety of Daniel's estate. The subject line read, "Urgent, unusual activity detected in trust fund, ending in 482. My fingers trembled so badly I mistyped my password twice. When the dashboard finally loaded, the air left my lungs. The account balance, which stood at over $5 million just yesterday, now read 0. I stared at the screen, blinking, praying it was a glitch. I clicked on the transaction history. There was one single, massive withdrawal. $5 million transferred to an entity called Solace Horizon Holdings. I clicked the details. The authorized signatory was not a hacker. It was not a stranger. The name on the digital receipt was Sienna Blake O'Connell. My stomach churned with bile. This was the account Daniel had specifically set up as a safeguard for me. He had called it the Mom Protection Fund. He promised me that no matter what happened to him, I would never have to worry about the mortgage or medical bills. But as I scrolled down, I saw that the terms of the trust had been altered. The authorization clause had been changed. My phone rang, shattering the silence of the kitchen. The caller ID flashed Sienna. I stared at the name for a long moment before answering. I did not speak. "Mom, Margaret, are you there?" Sienna's voice was high, pitched with a panic that sounded almost too perfect. "Please tell me you didn't see the email yet. It's a mess. A total mess. I am looking at the screen." "Sienna?" I said, my voice sounding detached, like it belonged to someone else. "Where is Daniel's money?" "Oh, God. Mom. Please listen," she stammered, the tears audible in her throat. It's a banking error. I tried to move a small portion for a tax break, just like the advisor said. But the system glitched. They moved everything. I'm fixing it. I promise. Please. Please don't call the lawyers yet. If you freeze the accounts, the bank will lock the funds for years. We'll lose everything." While she babbled, my eyes locked on a line of small print at the bottom of the transfer receipt. "Strategic reallocation authorized by surviving spouse only." It was not a glitch. It was a choice. "Come over," I said. "We need to look at the paperwork together." "I'm coming." She sniffled. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Do not call anyone. Margaret. Trust me." I hung up. The house was silent again. I walked into the living room and stood before the mantel. There was a photo of Daniel and me from his graduation. The frame was thick, made of dark oak. Daniel had been a gadget enthusiast, always tinkering with security tech. He had installed a high-definition nanny cam inside this frame years ago to catch the cleaning lady stealing silver. I had laughed at him then. I was not laughing now. I reached behind the frame and flipped the tiny switch. A small blue light blinked once, then vanished. Recording. Sienna arrived 19 minutes later. She was wearing black, dripping wet from the rain, looking every inch the grieving young widow. She rushed in and threw her arms around me, bringing the scent of expensive French perfume and damp wool. "I am so sorry. Mom," she wailed, pulling back to look at me with wide, wet eyes. "I have been on the phone with the bank all day. They are monsters." I led her to the kitchen table. I played the part she expected. I slumped my shoulders. I let my hands shake. I looked like the confused, elderly nurse who spent her life changing bedpans, not reading contracts. "I don't understand," I whispered, pouring her a glass of water. "The alert said the transfer happened at 3 in the afternoon. But you said you were at the cemetery visiting Daniel all afternoon." Sienna froze for a fraction of a second. She took a sip of water, her eyes darting to the side. I was," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I did it from my phone, right by his grave. I thought he would want me to be proactive. The advisor called me and said if I didn't sign the authorization right then, we'd lose the tax window. I panicked and clicked yes. "You clicked yes?" I asked softly, glancing at the living room where the camera lens was pointed directly at us. "So you authorized the transfer to this Solace Horizon company yourself?" I had to. Sienna grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. It was the only way to save the principal amount. "Margaret. But the bank. They messed up the destination account. But I signed it." "Yes, I signed it. I did it for us." She had just admitted it. She admitted she signed the transfer. She admitted full control. After another hour of performative tears and circular explanations, she left. She kissed my cheek and told me to get some sleep. When the front door clicked shut, the silence returned, heavier than before. I sat alone in the dark kitchen. I reached for the wooden box on the counter that held Daniel's ashes. I ran my thumb over the engraved brass nameplate. Sienna did not just steal $5 million. She had looked me in the eye, invoked my dead son's name, and lied without blinking. She had spat on every sacrifice Daniel had made to keep me safe. I was 64 years old. I was tired. But as I clutched the box of ash, I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. It was not grief anymore. It was fuel. Sitting there in the silence of my kitchen, with the digital glow of the empty bank account burned into my retinas, the past began to rewrite itself in my mind. The memories I had painted with the soft brush of maternal affection were now stripped bare, revealing the ugly, sharp edges I had chosen to ignore. I remembered the very first day Daniel brought her home. It was 3 years ago. Sienna was 30 years old, a striking woman with flaming red hair and a Hollywood smile that seemed too big for my small, dim living room. She introduced herself as a public relations specialist for Aurora Meridian Capital, a boutique investment firm in Manhattan that she claimed was disrupting the market. I was just a retired nurse from St. Gabriel Mercy Center. My life had been measured in 12-hour night shifts, the smell of antiseptic, and the quiet dignity of caring for the sick. Standing next to her glossy confidence, I felt grey and faded, like a piece of furniture that had been left in the sun too long. But Daniel looked at her as if she were the sun itself. So I swallowed my unease and opened my arms. The red flags started waving almost immediately. though I was colorblind to them at the time. Sienna walked through my house, her eyes scanning the crown moulding and the worn carpet not with curiosity, but with appraisal. "It is quaint," she had said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. "But don't you think Daniel deserves a life that reflects his true potential? This place feels so finished." She would often purse her lips when I told stories about working 3 shifts in a row to pay for Daniel's engineering degree. She did not see sacrifice. She saw inefficiency. And then came the questions. They were never about Daniel's childhood or his favorite color. They were always about numbers. She asked about the details of his life insurance policy. She asked about the workers' compensation settlement he had received from a minor accident at his old factory job. She even asked about the small plot of ancestral land we owned in Ohio. Margaret. She had asked over dinner one night, swirling her wine. Why keep that land? It is just dead capital. Daniel. He could leverage that into something real. When I brought this up to my son, he just laughed, patting my hand with that infuriatingly trusting smile of his. "Mom, stop worrying." He had said, "Sienna just wants to help me manage our future. She has a mind for finance. She is just looking out for us." They were married 6 months later. It was a rush job, frantic and expensive. Sienna insisted on a prenuptial agreement. She claimed it was to prove her love was pure, to show she wanted nothing from him if they divorced. But looking back, I recall the fine print she had glossed over. The agreement was heavily weighted with clauses that favored her specifically if the marriage ended due to sudden death rather than separation. Daniel's career took off shortly after. He became the chief engineer at Polar Ridge Systems, and the money started pouring in. It was Sienna who suggested setting up the trust fund. "We need to protect Mom," she had argued passionately. "If anything happens to you, Daniel, we need to make sure she is secure forever." It sounded so noble then. Now, I realized it was just her way of consolidating the assets into a pot she could eventually access. And then came the snow. The police report said it was a tragic accident, a icy night, a slippery bridge, and a car that lost control. Daniel went over the guardrail. They said he died on impact. At the funeral, Sienna was the picture of devastation. She threw herself onto the coffin. She clutched the urn to her chest, sobbing so hard she could barely stand. Everyone whispered about how much she loved him. But my mind drifted to a moment I had shoved aside that day. A man, one of Daniel's former colleagues, had approached me by the graveside. He looked pale, agitated. He had opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, Sienna had appeared at my elbow, gripping my arm tightly. "Thank you for coming," she had told the man, her voice sharp as glass. "Please, give us some space." She had dragged him away with her eyes, and I had let it happen, thinking I was just a grieving mother, imagining tension where there was none. Now, sitting alone in the dark, tracing the grain of the wood on my kitchen table, I realized the truth. Those were not accidents. They were calculations. I wondered how many other warning signs I had walked past, blindfolded by my love for my son. My bank account was empty, but my memory was finally, painfully full. The next morning, I walked into the lobby of Northlake Trust. I clutched my handbag tightly against my chest. Inside was the original copy of the trust documents Daniel had given me years ago. I did not wait for a teller. I walked straight to the reception desk and demanded to see a senior manager. In the past, I would have been too polite to make a scene. I would have sat in the waiting area for hours. But the woman who walked into that bank was not the same woman who had buried her son 8 months ago. Mr. Harmon, the branch manager, was a man who looked like he had been starched into his suit. He invited me into his office with a practiced smile that vanished the moment I laid the papers on his desk. "Mrs. O'Connell," he said, typing rapidly on his keyboard. "I see the transaction you are concerned about. However, our records show that the terms of the trust were updated 6 months after your son's passing." "Updated?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. "By whom? By the primary beneficiary?" "Sienna Blake O'Connell," Harmon replied, looking confused. "And co-signed by you. We have the authorization form right here. It removed you as a co-trustee and granted full autonomous control to the surviving spouse for investment purposes." He turned the monitor toward me. I leaned in, putting on my reading glasses. There it was. A document dated 2 months ago. At the bottom was a signature that purported to be mine. It was a clumsy, shaky loop of ink. But the most damning detail was not the waver in the line. It was the name. It was signed Margaret Ann O'Connell. "My middle name," I said, pointing a trembling finger at the screen, "is spelled with an E. Ann, not Anne. That is not my signature." Mr. Harmon paled. "Mrs. O'Connell, if this is true, this is a very serious accusation. Print it," I commanded. "Print everything. The transfer destination, the authorization, the history logs. Now." He did as I asked. I spent the next hour combing through the fresh ink. The entity that received the $5 million, Solace Horizon Holdings, was a ghost. I used my phone to look up the registration number listed on the transfer receipt. It had been incorporated in Delaware exactly 3 weeks ago. The registered address was a rental mailbox in a strip mall, and the sole executive officer was listed clearly Sienna Blake. But the knife twisted deeper when I turned the page to the original trust file. Mr. Harmon had printed the entire history, including scanned attachments I had never seen. Buried in the back was a handwritten note from Daniel, titled Letter of Intent. I recognized his handwriting immediately. It was the jagged, hurried scrawl of an engineer. "Mom is the only one I trust." The note read, "If anything happens to me, do not let anyone touch this money without Mom's consent. She knows what to do." I felt a sob catch in my throat, hot and sharp. Daniel had tried. He had tried to build a wall around me from beyond the grave. But the banking system, with its blind bureaucracy, had let a smiling woman with a forged signature tear that wall down brick by brick. I left the bank with a folder thick with evidence and drove straight to the office of Mr. Henderson, the elderly attorney who had handled my husband's will decades ago. I laid it all out before him. The forgery, the shell company, the lie. He looked through the documents, sighing heavily as he cleaned his spectacles. "Margaret," he said, his voice weary, "I believe you. But the law is a machine. And right now, the gears are grinding against you. Proving a forgery like this takes forensic experts. It takes time. And Sienna, she is the grieving young widow. Juries love young widows. They look at you and they see, well, they might see a confused mother who forgot she signed a paper. So you are telling me I should just let her keep $5 million, I asked, gripping the arms of the chair. "I am saying it will be expensive," Henderson said, "and painful. She has possession of the funds. She can hire a team of sharks from the city. I run a probate practice. Margaret. This. This is fraud on a level I am not equipped to fight. I walked out of his office into the grey afternoon. For the first time, I felt the crushing weight of systemic indifference to the world. I was just an old woman with red eyes and shaky hands. Sienna was the victim. I was the nuisance. That night, I sat in my kitchen and played the video file from the hidden camera again. I watched Sienna's face on my tablet screen. I listened to her voice, high and panicked, claiming it was a bank error. I tried to move a small portion, but the system glitched, she said on the recording. And then later, the slip. I signed it. Yes, I signed it. I did it for us. She had lied about the bank error. She had admitted to signing the transfer. And I had proof that the destination was a company she owned exclusively. This recording was not just a memory. It was a weapon. But Mr. Henderson was too dull to wield it. I turned off the tablet. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was heavy with purpose. If the men in suits thought I was too old to fight, I would find someone else. I needed someone who knew what it felt like to be underestimated. I needed someone who understood that family betrayal cuts deeper than any knife. I did not need a probate lawyer. I needed a wolf. The only person in Riverton Heights I trusted with a secret this ugly was Geneva Price. Geneva lived 2 doors down, a 70-year-old retired Chicago police officer who had spent 30 years working the beat in neighborhoods where people stopped calling 911 because they knew nobody was coming. She made coffee the way she lived black, bitter, and strong enough to wake the dead. I sat at her Formica kitchen table, recounting every detail while she listened. She did not gasp. She did not offer me a tissue. She just sat there, her arms crossed over her chest, tapping a manicured fingernail against her bicep. When I finished, Geneva let out a low, long whistle. "Honey," she said, her voice gravelly and warm. "She ain't just stealing your money. She is pouring concrete over your self-respect and burying you alive under it. And she thinks because you got grey hair, you are just going to lie there and suffocate." I stared into my coffee cup. Mr. Henderson said it would be too hard to prove. He said, juries love young widows. Henderson is a fool who hasn't seen the inside of a courtroom since the Reagan administration. Geneva scoffed. She leaned forward, her face softening. "You know why I retired, Margaret. It wasn't the bad knees. It was my own son, Marcus. 5 years ago, that boy gambled away his life savings and tried to cover it by taking a loan out against my pension. He forged my signature on a power of attorney. I almost lost this house. I was ready to let him do it, too, out of some twisted motherly guilt. But then I met Marisol Vega. She is a pit bull in a pencil skirt." Geneva grinned, pulling out her phone. "She grew up in Little Village. She hates financial predators more than she hates bad coffee. She got my money back, and she made sure Marcus went to rehab instead of prison. But she made him pay back every cent. You don't need a probate lawyer, Margaret. You need a fraud specialist." Geneva dialed a number and put it on speaker. "Vega." A voice answered instantly. It was deep, clear, and busy. "It's Geneva." I got another one. "Marisol. Worse than Marcus. This one involves $5 million, a dead husband, and a daughter-in-law who thinks she is smarter than God." There was a pause on the line. Then, the voice softened. "Bring her in. 3 o'clock. The offices of the Everhart and Vega Law Group were not in a glass skyscraper. but in a renovated brick warehouse downtown. Marisol Vega was younger than I expected, maybe in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She did not offer me tea or sympathy. She offered me a chair and a notepad. "Start from the beginning," she said, "and do not leave out the parts that make you feel stupid. Those are usually where the evidence is." I told her everything. I showed her the bank statements. I showed her the fake signature. Finally, I pulled out my tablet and played the video from the kitchen. Marisol watched it twice. She leaned in when Sienna's voice warbled about the bank error. She paused the video right when Sienna said, "I moved it all. I did it for us." "There," Marisol said, pointing her pen at the frozen image of my crying daughter-in-law. "That is admissible." She claims it was a glitch, but then she claims agency in the next breath. It contradicts her affidavit to the bank. She sat back, tapping the pen against her lip. "Mrs. O'Connell, we are going to attack this on 3 levels, Marisol said, her tone precise. "Level 1 is civil. We file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning to freeze that $5 million before she moves it offshore. Level 2 is criminal. We hand the forgery evidence to the district attorney. But level 3... She paused, looking at me carefully. "Level 3 is the foundation. We need to reopen the investigation into your son's accident." My heart stopped. The air left the room. The accident," I stammered, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. "But the police said it was the snow. They said he lost control." "Police reports are written by tired people who want to go home," Marisol said, her voice dropping lower, losing its professional edge for a moment. Sienna had a prenup that favored her if he died suddenly. She moved the money immediately. "She forged your signature while the body was still warm. You told me the airbag didn't deploy properly." "Right. Or at least, that is what you heard at the funeral. I don't want to think about that," I whispered, feeling the bile rise in my throat. "If I think about that, it means she didn't just steal from him. It means—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The idea that Daniel had been murdered was a door I had bolted shut in my mind. Marisol leaned across the desk and took my hand. Her grip was firm, grounding. "Margaret, listen to me," she said, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "Revenge is just noise if it isn't focused. True revenge, true justice, only has meaning when it is based on the truth. And sometimes, the truth is crueler than any theory you have ever dared to imagine. Are you brave enough to know what really happened on that bridge?" I looked at Geneva. She nodded slowly. Then I looked back at Marisol. "Do it," I said, though my voice shook. "Find out everything." The conference room at Everhart and Vega felt less like a law office and more like a surgical theatre. The air was cold, conditioned to protect the servers humming in the corner. Marisol had brought in Jonah Ruiz, a forensic accountant who looked more like a tired librarian than a financial hunter. He did not speak much. He just pointed at the spiderweb of lines projected onto the smartboard. "Solace Horizon was just the final bucket," Jonah explained, tapping the screen. "Sienna has been siphoning funds for 2 years. She set up 3 different shell companies, one in Nevada, one in Wyoming, and Solace in Delaware. I watched the red lines intersect. Small streams of money from Daniel's salary, his accident compensation, and even the dividends from his stock options had been trickling out of our lives and into these black holes. They were labeled as consulting fees or administrative costs. But here is the kicker. Jonah said, highlighting a name on the shareholder list for the Wyoming entity. She is not the only beneficiary. 10% of the equity is held by a man named Kyle Mercer. My breath hitched. Kyle, Daniel's best friend. The man who had stood beside me at the funeral, handing me tissues. The man who was the first person on the scene the night Daniel died. Kyle is involved, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He ate Christmas dinner at my table. He is doing more than eating, Marisol said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. Geneva called in a favor with her old precinct captain. She got us the unredacted field notes from the accident scene. Read the highlighted section. I put on my glasses. The text was grainy, a photocopy of a photocopy. It was a transcript of a 911 call from a passing motorist that the responding officers had dismissed as unreliable. Caller states seeing two male figures standing near the guardrail immediately prior to the vehicle going over. Caller notes the vehicle did not appear to skid, but accelerated. 2 men, I said, looking up at Marisol. The police said he lost control due to ice. They said he was alone. The investigation was closed in 48 hours because the weather was bad and nobody wanted to do the paperwork for a homicide on a frozen bridge. Geneva said from the corner, her arms crossed, if Kyle was there. And he is on Sienna's payroll. Then it wasn't an accident. I finished, the realization settling over me like a shroud. Jonah clicked the remote again. We recovered a deleted text thread from a cloud backup of Daniel's phone. This was sent 3 days before he died. To Kyle. The message appeared on the screen. I do not agree with your guys' plan. C is going too far with Mom's money. I am shutting it down on Monday. He knew, Marisol said softly. Daniel found out they were using his accounts to wash money for something bigger. Probably connected to that investment firm Sienna worked for. He tried to stop them. I closed my eyes. My son had not just died. He had been erased because he tried to protect me. We need to move fast, Marisol said, her voice snapping back to professional steel. I filed an ex parte motion this morning to freeze every asset attached to Sienna's name under the Elder Abuse and Dependent Adult Civil Protection Act. We are arguing that she is a flight risk with your funds. Will it work? I asked. It should have, Marisol replied, looking grim. But she is fast. An hour ago, the title for the penthouse she just bought in the city was transferred to an anonymous LLC. She knows we are coming. She is liquidating. So we lost the money. I felt the panic rising again. No, Marisol said. We just changed the game. If we chase the money, she will hide it. So we need to make her come to us. We need to make her greedy. She outlined the plan. It was terrifyingly simple. We would bait Sienna. We would present her with an opportunity so illegal and so lucrative that she would not be able to resist. We would trick her into admitting she controlled the stolen $5 million. Margaret, Marisol said, leaning forward. I need you to act, not like a victim, but like a woman who is confused and looking for a way to invest her remaining assets. You are going to introduce her to a man who can help her wash that money clean. Who is the man I asked? An associate of ours, Marisol said. But to pull this off, you have to look her in the eye and lie. Can you do that? I thought of the 2 figures on the bridge. I thought of Daniel's text message. I thought of Kyle Mercer eating my roast beef while plotting my son's death. I spent 40 years telling people their loved ones were going to be okay when I knew they were dying. I said, my voice steady. I know how to lie. Marisol, tell me what to say. Geneva introduced me to Victor Lane in her living room. He was a man in his 50s with a tan that looked like it came from a bottle and a suit that cost more than my first car. In reality, he was an old friend of Marisol's, a former forensic auditor who now enjoyed playing the role of a shark. He looked at me with a shark's grin. "Mrs. O'Connell," Victor said, smoothing his silk tie. "Marisol tells me we are going fishing. I hope you are ready to put a worm on the hook." I was ready. That evening, I met Sienna at a wine bar in downtown Chicago. I wore my oldest cardigan and let my shoulders slump. I ordered a hot tea while she swirled a glass of Pinot Noir. "I have been feeling so guilty." "Sienna," I said, keeping my voice small, "I have $5 million sitting there, and I don't know how to grow it. I feel like I am failing Daniel's legacy." Sienna's eyes lit up instantly. She leaned in, placing a hand on my arm. "Mum, you aren't failing him?" She cooed. "But cash loses value if it sits. You have to be aggressive. That is what Mr. Lane said," I replied, dropping the bait. "I met him at the club. He runs a private equity fund. He said he doubles investments in 6 months. But, oh, I don't know. He only works with sophisticated investors." Sienna froze. The greed in her eyes was so naked it was almost obscene. "Victor Lane?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "I think I have heard of him. He is legendary. Mom, if you have an in with him, we cannot waste it." "But the paperwork is so messy," I said, wringing my hands. "The bank was so difficult about my signature last time. I don't want to go through that again." Sienna waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry about the bank. I have a contact there. I smoothed things over. If we move the money to Solace Horizon, I can handle everything. You won't have to lift a pen." She had just admitted to manipulating the bank processes. I smiled weakly. "Well," I said, "maybe you should meet him." 2 days later, we were in the office of Solace Horizon Holdings. It was a glass-walled cubicle in a shared workspace building, hardly the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar firm. Victor sat at the head of the small table, looking bored. "I don't usually take on small accounts, Mrs. Blake," Victor said, looking at his watch. "And I don't deal with committees. If I invest this $5 million, I need to know who has the final say. I don't want to be chasing down an old lady for a signature every time I need to move capital." Sienna bristled. She pulled a laptop out of her bag and slammed it on the table. "I am the sole decision-maker," she declared, her voice sharp. "Margaret is just a silent beneficiary. Look." She opened a folder of PDF documents and spun the laptop around. Victor leaned in, tapping his smartwatch to ensure the recording was clear. "This is the transfer authorization," Sienna said, pointing to the screen. "I executed this myself. The bank questioned the co-trustee signature, but I paid a small, let's call it an administrative fee, to a manager to look the other way. I have total control. Mr. Lane, the money is mine to move." Victor smiled, a cold, predatory thing. Impressive. "You know how to get things done." While they talked, I stood up, pretending to admire the view of the parking lot. I wandered over to Sienna's desk. It was cluttered with papers. My eyes drifted over a stack of mail and landed on a document with the logo of a major auto insurance company. It was a rejection letter for a claim regarding Daniel's car. I glanced at the text. Claim denied. Forensic analysis of the vehicle control module indicates the passenger and driver side airbags were manually disabled prior to ignition. The world stopped spinning. The noise of the office faded into a dull roar. Manually disabled. I whispered to myself. Daniel was an engineer. He was obsessed with safety. He would never disable an airbag. Someone else had done it. Someone who knew he would be driving on a bridge in an ice storm. Mom Sienna's voice cut through the fog. Are you okay? You look pale. I turned around. I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I forced a smile onto my lips, even though my insides were screaming. I am fine, dear, I said. Just a little dizzy. I think I need some air. I walked out of that building with my handbag clutched so tightly my knuckles turned white. I walked through the parking lot, putting one foot in front of the other, fighting the urge to vomit. This was not a game anymore. This was not about theft. That night, in Marisol's office, I told them what I saw. The room went deadly silent. Marisol stopped taking notes. Her face went dark. Manually disabled, Marisol repeated, her voice low and dangerous. That takes access. That takes planning. That is not negligence. Margaret, that is homicide. She killed him, I said, my voice breaking. She didn't just want the money. She wanted him gone so she wouldn't have to share it. Marisol stood up and walked to the window. When she turned back, she looked like a general preparing for war. The plan has changed, Marisol said. We are not just taking her money. Margaret, we are going to put her in a cage for the rest of her life. The order to freeze Sienna's assets was executed at 7 a.m. I watched it happen on my iPad while drinking black coffee in my kitchen. Sienna was in the middle of a live stream from her new penthouse, talking to her thousands of followers about finding the strength to smile again. She looked radiant, bathed in ring light, holding a green smoothie. You just have to trust the universe, she was saying, her voice soft and practiced. Daniel would want me to live my best life. Then the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp on the audio feed. Sienna frowned, confused. She walked toward the door, leaving the camera running. I heard the muffled voices of the Financial Crimes Unit and the court marshals. I heard the words seizure order and fraud investigation. Sienna ran back into the frame, her face pale, scrambling to knock the phone over. The feed cut to black, but it was too late. Someone had screen recorded it. By noon, the clip of the perfect widow being raided by the police had been shared 10,000 times. The cracks in her porcelain mask were finally visible to the world. 2 days later, we faced each other in civil court. The room was packed. Sienna sat with her head down, flanked by a high-priced defense attorney named Sterling. He stood up and adjusted his cufflinks, looking at me with pity that felt like a slap. Your Honor, Sterling began, his voice smooth as oil. This is a tragic misunderstanding. My client's mother-in-law is elderly, grieving, and, well, frankly confused. Mrs. O'Connell clearly does not understand the complex financial instruments my client used to lawfully protect the estate. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. I let him paint me as the senile old woman. It made what happened next satisfy me even more. Marisol stood up. She did not use adjectives. She used data. She played the recording from my kitchen where Sienna admitted to signing the transfer. She played the audio from the meeting with Victor Lane where Sienna bragged about bribing a bank manager. She displayed the registration papers for the shell companies. Sienna's face drained of colour. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Then, the lawyer representing Northlake Trust stood up. The bank was terrified of the bad publicity. They were ready to cut the infection out to save the body. "Your Honour," the bank's lawyer said, his voice shaking slightly. "Northlake Trust acknowledges that internal protocols were violated. We are fully cooperating with the district attorney. We have evidence that Ms. Blake O'Connell solicited an employee to bypass dual authorization safeguards." Sienna stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Panic had replaced her poise. "No," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the back of the room. "I didn't do it alone. I didn't know. It was Kyle Mercer made me do it. He took advantage of me. I was a grieving widow, and he made me sign things I didn't understand." Marisol smiled. It was a small, cold smile. She nodded to the bailiff. The side door opened, and Kyle Mercer walked in. He looked 10 years older than he had at the funeral. He avoided looking at Sienna. "Mr. Mercer has accepted a plea deal in exchange for full immunity regarding the fraud charges," Marisol announced. Kyle took the stand. He did not look at the jury. He looked at his hands. "It wasn't my idea," Kyle said, his voice flat. "Sienna approached me 2 weeks after the funeral. She said she needed a partner to move the money before Mrs. O'Connell noticed. She used the $5 million as seed money. She promised me 10%. The judge pounded his gavel to silence the gallery, but the nightmare for Sienna was not over. The district attorney, a stern woman in a grey suit, stepped forward. "Your Honour," the DA said, based on the testimony of Mr. Mercer and new forensic evidence regarding the tampering of the victim's vehicle safety systems. "The state is upgrading this investigation. We are filing charges for grand larceny, forgery, and we are opening a homicide inquiry." 2 officers moved toward Sienna. She screamed. It was a raw, animal sound that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage. As they clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists, she twisted around, her eyes locking onto mine. "You ruined my life," she shrieked, her face contorted and ugly. "Are you happy Daniel is dead? He is dead. That money won't bring him back." The room went silent, waiting for the grieving mother to break. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my skirt. I looked her in the eye, and I felt absolutely nothing but the cold clarity of justice. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "But it might save other people from you. And that is what Daniel would want me to do." They dragged her out. I watched her go. I turned my back on her screams and walked out of the courtroom, into the blinding light of the afternoon. After the adrenaline of the courtroom faded, the silence in my house felt like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by photo albums. I traced the face of the blonde toddler playing in the backyard sprinkler, the awkward teenager in the oversized graduation gown, and finally, the man in the tuxedo standing at the altar. In every picture, Daniel looked at the world with such open, trusting eyes. That trust was what killed him. The guilt crashed over me in waves, colder and darker than the river he had fallen into. I had not protected him. I had opened the door to the monster, let her sit at our table, and let her marry him. My mind kept replaying the mechanics of the accident. I became obsessed with the airbag. I closed my eyes and saw the bridge. I saw the snow swirling in the headlights. I felt the sickening lurch of the tires losing their grip on the black ice. In that split second of terror, when the bumper hit the rail, the car should have exploded with white safety pillows. It should have been a violent, saving embrace. Instead, there was nothing but metal and glass and the unforgiving dark. The silence of that non-deployment haunted me more than the crash itself. It was the mechanical equivalent of the warnings I had ignored. The front door opened, and Geneva walked in. She did not knock. She saw me sitting on the floor, clutching the wooden box of ashes to my chest, rocking back and forth. She did not say a word. She simply lowered her bad knees onto the carpet beside me, put a warm hand on my shoulder, and sat there. We stayed like that for an hour, a new ritual of mourning where language was unnecessary. I let her in. Geneva, I finally whispered, my voice cracking. He slept next to her every night. She knew what was going to happen to him. She planned it. And then she stood at his grave and cried, and I hugged her. I comforted the woman who killed my son. Geneva squeezed my shoulder hard. You didn't know. Margaret, evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a pretty girl in a wedding dress. Later that week, Marisol called me into her office. Her face was grim. We got the preliminary forensic report on the car's computer module, she said, sliding a paper across the desk. There are tool marks on the casing. Someone definitely tampered with the sensor array manually, but the prints were wiped clean. We cannot prove who held the screwdriver. She tapped a grainy photo on her laptop screen. It was a still frame from a traffic camera at the end of the bridge, taken 20 minutes before the crash. A tall, thin figure was standing near where Daniel's car went over. It looks like Kyle, Marisol said, but the resolution is too low for a positive ID. However, under the pressure of the plea deal, Kyle gave us something else. He claims Sienna told him, if something happens to Daniel, everything becomes simple. He insists he only disabled the sensors because Sienna asked him to debug a glitch in the system. He is claiming ignorance of intent. He is lying, I said, feeling the cold rage simmering again. He knew. He is lying to save his own skin. Marisol agreed. The law might not have enough to pin a murder charge on them without a confession or a witness. We might get them on fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy. But murder, it is going to be a hard climb. I realized then that the gavel might never come down for the crime that truly mattered. The law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. A mother only required instinct. That night, I drove to the bridge. The snow was gone, replaced by the damp chill of spring. I stood by the guardrail, watching the cars stream by like a river of light. I looked down into the black water. I will never know the whole story. Daniel? I whispered to the wind. I will never know if you were scared, or if you knew it was them. But I promise you this, they will never spend a dime of what you left behind. I took the money back. I took their names. I took their future. For the first time in 8 months, I did not feel like I was drowning with him. I felt like I was standing on the shore, wet and shivering, but alive. I started attending a support group for parents who had lost children. For weeks, I just sat in the back, listening. I heard stories of overdoses, of stray bullets, of cancers that moved too fast. I realized my pain was unique in its details, but universal in its depth. I was not the only one who had been betrayed by the universe. In the 4th session, I finally raised my hand. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly. "My name is Margaret," I said to the circle of strangers. And for a long time, I thought my life ended when my son died. I spent half my life being a silent victim, thinking kindness was enough to protect my family. It wasn't. So for the rest of my life, I accept being an active survivor. I am learning that justice is not something you are given. It is something you have to take. With Marisol guiding the ship, we launched a full-scale civil offensive to reclaim the entire $5 million. At the same time, the criminal case was gathering steam like a freight train. North Lake Trust, terrified of a public inquest into their lax security protocols, was eager to settle. They admitted significant procedural errors and agreed to a substantial payout to avoid being named as co-defendants in the fraud suit. Suddenly, the silent widow had a war chest. I did not buy a yacht. I did not buy a summer home. Instead, I took a chunk of that recovered money and established the Daniels Second Chance Fund. It was designed to provide legal and financial aid to seniors who had been financially strip-mined by their own flesh and blood. I rented a small, dust-filled storefront on the main street of Riverton Heights, with a fresh coat of sage green paint and the smell of roasting beans. It became my new headquarters. It was half coffee shop, half triage center. Seniors could come in for a cappuccino and leave with a free consultation on their will or a review of suspicious emails. It was a place where nobody would ever roll their eyes and call them paranoid. Geneva appointed herself the honorary head of security. She sat by the door most mornings, drinking her black coffee and eyeing strangers with a look that could curdle milk. Marisol sent over a rotating squad of bright-eyed law interns. They sat at the back tables with their laptops, helping bewildered grandmothers check their credit reports or decipher confusing insurance policies. Mrs. O'Connell, one of the interns, a sweet girl named Sarah, asked me one afternoon, "How do I tell this gentleman his grandson is definitely scamming him without breaking his heart?" "You don't break it." "Honey?" I told her, wiping down the counter. "You just hold his hand while it breaks, so he doesn't have to pick up the pieces alone." I even learned how to use Zoom. It was a comedy of errors at first, involving a lot of shouting at the screen and accidental mute buttons. But eventually, I was hosting weekly support groups for seniors across the state. I listened to stories that mirrored my own in frightening ways. Accounts drained by nephews with gambling debts. Houses signed over to daughters who promised care that never came. The local newspaper ran a Sunday feature on me. The headline read, "The Widow Who Bit Back. How Margaret O'Connell is Changing the Game." Most people cheered for me. I became a sort of folk hero for the AARP crowd. One rainy Tuesday, a man about my age walked into the shop. He looked like he had not slept in a week. He ordered a black coffee and stood there, wringing his hands. "I am Kyle's father," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the espresso machine. The shop went quiet. Geneva started to rise from her chair, but I waved her down. "I know," I said. I recognized the slope of his shoulders. He pleaded guilty, the man said, tears welling in his eyes. "He is going to prison for 5 years. I wanted to say I am sorry. I don't know where I went wrong with him. I thought I taught him better than to take what isn't his." I walked around the counter. I did not see the father of my son's accomplice. I saw another parent drowning in the wreckage their child had made. "We did the best we could," I said, taking his hand. Sometimes they just break, and we are not the ones who broke them. We stood there and cried for a minute, two strangers united by a shared, heavy shame. Then he drank his coffee and left, and I went back to work. Sienna's lawyers were getting desperate. They reached out to Marisol, offering a deal. If I dropped the civil lawsuit and stopped pushing for maximum penalties, Sienna would return the remaining funds and plead to a lesser charge. Tell them no. I told Marisol over the phone. I cannot pull the knife out of the wound until I am sure the infection is gone. I started speaking at library basements and church halls. Every time I told my story, the knot in my chest loosened a little more. I was turning my horror into a shield for others, but the peace was fragile. The criminal trial was approaching, and the air was thick with tension. One evening, Marisol came to the shop after we had closed. She looked worried. "Margaret, sit down," she said, pulling out a chair. Sienna's defense team just submitted their discovery list for the trial. They have a wild card. What kind of wild card, I asked, feeling a cold prickle on my neck. They found something in Daniel's personal safe deposit box that we missed, Marisol said. It is a document, a real one, and Sienna's lawyer claims it is going to blow our motive theory out of the water. They say it is a secret Daniel kept from everyone, even you. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed tight. Reporters lined the back wall, but the front rows were filled with faces I knew. My regulars from the coffee shop had come, clutching their notebooks like students at a lecture. They were not just spectators. They were witnesses to what happens when someone finally fights back. The prosecutor was surgical in her opening. She laid out the timeline of the fraud, the forged signatures, and the shell companies. She painted Sienna not as a grieving widow, but as a predator who had viewed my son's death as a business transaction. She brought up the tampered airbag sensors, not as a murder charge, which they still could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but as character evidence of extreme moral depravity. Then, Sienna's defense attorney stood up. He was a theatrical man who loved a surprise. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, holding up a piece of paper sealed in plastic. "The prosecution wants you to believe Mrs. Blake O'Connell acted out of greed. But we have found a letter, a handwritten letter from Daniel O'Connell himself, found in the back of a drawer in the couple's apartment." He projected the image onto the screen. It was Daniel's handwriting. The room went silent as he read the highlighted line. "If anything happens to me, trust Sienna. She knows what is best for this money." For a moment, the air left the room. Every head turned to look at me. The narrative I had built that Daniel had only trusted me seemed to crumble. I felt the floor slipping away, the same vertigo I had felt the night the police knocked on my door. Had I been wrong? Had I misjudged everything? Marisol stood up. She did not look rattled. She looked bored. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "We request a recess to examine this new evidence." An hour later, we were back. Marisol walked to the center of the room. "This letter," she said, holding the plastic sheet, "is indeed in Daniel's handwriting. However, forensic dating of the ink and the paper stock reveals that this specific brand of stationery was manufactured 1 year after Daniel died. And the signature, it is a high-resolution digital scan, printed onto the page. It is a forgery, and a sloppy one at that." Sienna's lawyer slumped in his chair, but Marisol was not done. "And since we are discussing Daniel's true intentions," Marisol continued, "we would like to present a piece of evidence recovered just yesterday from a hidden partition in Daniel's cloud account. a video recorded on his phone 3 days before the accident. The screens in the courtroom flickered to life, and there he was. Daniel. He was sitting in the driver's seat of his car, the grey interior familiar and heartbreaking. He looked tired. He looked scared. "Hey, Mum," Daniel said from the grave, his voice filling the silent room. "If you are watching this, it means something bad happened. I found out what Sienna and Kyle are doing. They are using my accounts to move dirty money for her firm. I locked them out of the trust this morning. I am going to the lawyers on Monday." He paused, looking out the car window, then back at the lens. "I am scared." "Mum?" he whispered. She is acting strange. I think she might do something crazy when she finds out the money is gone. Mum, if anything happens to me, don't trust anyone. Don't trust her. Only trust yourself. I am so sorry I let things go this far." The video cut to black. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then, a single sob broke out from the gallery. Sienna was not crying. She was staring at the black screen, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The misunderstood widow defense had just been incinerated by the victim himself. The jury did not need long. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts grand larceny, 2 counts of forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge, clearly moved by the video, recommended the maximum sentence and ordered full restitution of the $5 million plus interest. As the bailiffs moved to cuff her, Sienna whipped around to face me. The tears were gone. The mask was gone. "You ruined my life," she hissed, her voice venomous. "Are you happy now? You won. But he is still dead. That money won't bring him back." I looked at her, at the woman I had once welcomed into my home, and felt a great weight lift off my shoulders. "No," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But he can rest now." She was led away, screaming, while the cameras flashed. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, feeling the first real breath of air I had taken in over a year. Months later, I stood in the center of the Daniels Second Chance Fund. The coffee machine was hissing, and the tables were full of seniors getting the help they needed. On the wall, framed simply, was a picture of Daniel. Below it, I had stenciled 3 words, "Trust yourself first," that night. I took the wooden box to the small lake in Riverton Heights, where Daniel used to fish as a boy. The moon was full, reflecting off the black water. I opened the lid. I took a handful of the grey ash and let the wind carry it out over the ripples. "I was too late to save you, my sweet boy," I whispered into the dark. "But I saved your name. For the first time since the knock on my door, I went home and slept. I did not dream of the bridge. I did not dream of the money. I dreamt of Daniel, standing in the sun, smiling at me without a shadow in his eyes. Thanks so much for sticking with me through this emotional roller coaster. Y'all, I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. It is always amazing to see how far our family reaches. Please don't forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story get heard by everyone who needs it.